The daylight bombing war over Europe did not announce itself with drama, but with routine. And that routine was lethal. Every morning engines were warmed, maps unfolded, and crews climbed into aluminum compartments knowing the odds were quietly worsening. German radar nets thickened, fighter controls sharpened. Flak belts grew denser around industrial targets. In this environment, survival itself became noteworthy. One B-17, anonymous in serial number and paint, kept returning. Not untouched, not triumphant, simply present. Its persistence drew no headlines, yet it unsettled assumptions built into interception tables and loss forecasts, hinting that something within the predictable machinery of air war was not behaving as expected. This aircraft flew with formations that suffered steadily rising losses as the campaign matured. Early optimism faded as German tactics adapted, compressing attack windows and exploiting brief separations between bombers. Crews learned to read the sky for danger signs, the glint of distant contrails, the unnatural stillness before flak bursts. For this crew, survival did not hinge on luck alone. Checklists were obeyed with precision, gunners tracked sectors without fixation, and minor adjustments in altitude and timing accumulated into margins that mattered. Nothing about these habits was secret, yet their combination repeatedly disrupted enemy expectations. German intercept doctrine at this stage relied on predictability, assuming bomber boxes would maintain altitude, speed, and spacing under pressure. On paper, the responses were sound, vectoring fighters into frontal passes and coordinated rear attacks. Against most formations, this logic held, yet this single bomber seemed to slip through the seams created by rigid planning. Slight delays in bomb run alignment, marginally altered throttle settings, and disciplined radio silence reduced the clarity of the picture German controllers expected. These were small deviations, invisible individually, but together they eroded the efficiency of an otherwise lethal system. Inside the aircraft, the environment was defined by cold vibration, a noise that never fully receded. Oxygen masks stiffened faces, and frost crept along metal surfaces despite constant engine heat. The crew moved within narrow roles, each decision constrained by procedure and the awareness that error cascaded quickly at altitude. Emotional responses were muted not by bravery, but by repetition. Fear existed as a background condition, managed through focus and routine. The bomber's continued return created no illusion of safety, only a quiet pressure to uphold standards that had so far kept disaster at bay. Mission after mission reinforced the contrast between expectation and outcome. Other aircraft failed to return, leaving gaps that closed automatically as formations compressed under fire. The empty spaces were noted, but rarely discussed, absorbed into statistics that grew steadily harsher. When this bomber landed again, ground crews marked fresh damage, replaced panels, and sent it back into the air without ceremony. The absence of celebration reflected an understanding shared across airfields. Survival was temporary still. Patterns were forming, subtle enough to avoid superstition yet persistent enough to be noticed by those tracking losses. From the German perspective, interception reports suggested success. Ammunition expenditure aligned with expected damage, and claimed victories matched historical averages. Yet discrepancies accumulated at the margins. Radar plots showed formations thinning less than anticipated, and pilot debriefs occasionally contradicted controller assumptions. The system absorbed these anomalies without immediate correction, attributing them to chance or weather. In reality, the air battle was becoming a contest between learning processes. While German defenses optimized for the average bomber, this crew operated just outside that average, benefiting from disciplined execution rather than technological advantage. Weather compounded uncertainty on both sides. Cloud layers shifted altitudes unexpectedly, altering visual acquisition and flak effectiveness. Sun glare could blind gunners or silhouette fighters at critical moments. Navigators compensated constantly, adjusting headings to remain with information while avoiding overexposure. These environmental variables favored crews who responded smoothly rather than aggressively. The bomber's survival owed much to this restraint. to choices that minimized risk rather than chased advantage. Such decisions rarely appeared in after-action summaries, yet they shaped outcomes as decisively as any burst of fire or mechanical failure. Psychological strain accumulated quietly. Sleep was fragmented, appetite dulled, and the body adapted to stress. By narrowing attention, the crew measured time not in days but in sorties completed and targets survived. Each return added weight to the next departure, an unspoken obligation to repeat what had worked before. Complacency was actively resisted, treated as a greater threat than fear. In this atmosphere, the notion of a secret weapon never took root internally. What existed instead was a culture of incremental correction, maintained under conditions that punished inconsistency as losses mounted elsewhere. Analysts began isolating variables that might explain deviations. Formation integrity, escort proximity, and timing were re-examined. This bomber appeared in reports as an outlier rather than a model. Its survival statistically inconvenient, the tendency was to smooth such irregularities away, preserving confidence in established doctrine, yet war rarely rewards rigid certainty. By continuing to survive, the aircraft exerted pressure on assumptions without openly challenging them. Its presence suggested that adaptability within strict systems could yield temporary advantage, even against an enemy rapidly refining its own methods. The chapter closes not with revelation, but with equilibrium, a moment when patterns exist without interpretation. The bomber taxis back into line, another mission logged, another set of risks deferred rather than resolved. German defenses continue to evolve, confident in systems that have delivered results across thousands of engagements. On both sides, professionals adapt within constraints imposed by machines, weather, and doctrine. Nothing here suggests immunity or destiny. The continued survival of this crew remains a condition, not a conclusion, shaped by discipline, circumstance, and the fragile space between expectation and reality that defines aerial warfare at this stage. It is within this unresolved balance that the wider campaign proceeds, indifferent to individual narratives yet quietly influenced by them in ways rarely recognized. Until much later, at this moment, survival itself is the only measurable outcome, provisional and contingent, carried forward sortie by sortie, without promise of continuation. In an unforgiving sky, overoccupied Europe at dawn, again. By the time the bomber's survival began to register beyond its own crew, the air war had entered a phase where patience was wearing thin. Loss charts no longer fluctuated. They climbed with mechanical regularity. German fighter units were being bled by escorting Mustangs when they strayed too long, while American formations were cut apart whenever protection failed to arrive. In this tightening system, anything that did not conform drew attention. The bomber's repeated returns were no longer dismissed as chance. They became data points, quietly marked and revisited as analysts sought reasons why one aircraft persisted where others did not. The Luftwaffe response did not shift abruptly. It adjusted through routine refinement, the same process that governed every operational change. Interception briefings grew more detailed. Controllers began emphasizing relative position within formations rather than overall bomber mass. Pilots were instructed to note altitude deviations and means of defensive fire. Over time, reports converged. This bomber tended to hold its place when others drifted, avoided sudden corrections during flak runs, and preserved cohesion under stress. None of this suggested a technological advantage. It pointed instead to behavior, something harder to counter, but not impossible to model. As German tactics evolved, the sky became less forgiving. Fighters approached with narrower margins, compressing attack angles to reduce exposure to crossfire. Altitude bands were adjusted to exploit blind spots beneath bomber formations. The cumulative effect was subtle but relentless, stripping away the small freedoms crews relied on to manage fear and fatigue. For the bomber's crew, these changes were felt physically. Attacks came closer together, leaving less time to reset weapons or clear icing. The airframe shuddered under near misses, and the interior smelled constantly of burned cordite and oil. Escort limitations magnified the pressure. Fuel constraints forced fighters to turn back sooner, leaving bombers exposed during critical legs of the route. The gap between protection and vulnerability was measured in minutes. Yet within those minutes, the full weight of German defense descended. The bombers' earlier habit of slipping through these windows grew harder to sustain. Where once timing had offered relief, now it only delayed contact. The crew adapted by tightening internal rhythms, anticipating rather than reacting. But each mission demanded more from bodies already worn thin. Psychological strain deepened in parallel. The knowledge of being observed, even indirectly, altered behavior. Crews spoke less, conserving energy and attention. Humor faded, replaced by procedural calm that bordered on detachment. Sleep before missions grew shallow, interrupted by the imagined sounds of engines and flak. The bomber's continued operation was no longer a quiet anomaly, but a test case within an increasingly optimized system. Survival felt conditional, granted one sortie at a time rather than assumed until proven otherwise. German pilots experienced their own form of compression. Opportunities for error narrowed as a light air superiority grew unevenly across sectors. Every interception carried risk, and losses were no longer absorbed easily. This sharpened focus rather than dulling it. Engagements became shorter, more violent, and less forgiving. Against this backdrop, the bombers' discipline patterns became vulnerabilities. Predictability, once a shield against chaos, now offered a target for methodical planning. The decisive engagement unfolded without ceremony. Weather was unremarkable, visibility adequate, wind steady. Conditions favored neither side, stripping away excuses and leaving preparation exposed. As formations crossed into defended airspace, German controllers executed plans refined through weeks of observation. Fighters were vectored not toward the densest clusters but toward specific positions calculated to disrupt internal cohesion. The bomber found itself bracketed, attacks arriving from angles previously avoided. Defensive fire remained controlled, but ammunition drained faster under sustained pressure. Inside the aircraft, procedures held even as options narrowed. Damage accumulated in increments rather than catastrophes, each hit compromising systems that had once absorbed punishment with ease. Oxygen lines stiffened, controls grew heavy, and engines labored under strain. The crews experienced delayed failure, but could not prevent it. Decisions became reactive by necessity. Responses shaped by immediate survival rather than long-term pattern. The moment when control slipped was not dramatic. It was marked by reduced responsiveness. A subtle lag between command and result. Formation spacing widened just enough to invite concentrated attack. German fighters exploited the opening with practiced economy, disengaging and returning with precision that reflected institutional learning rather than individual aggression. The bombers' defenses faltered as coordination degraded, each crew member compensating locally, while the larger system unraveled. When the aircraft finally fell away from formation, it did so without spectacle. Smoke trailed, altitude dropped, and the sky that had once offered room to maneuver closed in. The engagement concluded as planned, not as hoped. For German forces, it represented validation of adaptation under pressure. For the bomber's crew, it was the endpoint of a sequence shaped by discipline, experience, and limits imposed by an enemy that learned as quickly as they did. The air war absorbed the outcome without pause. Losses were recorded, formations adjusted, and missions resumed. No single engagement altered the campaign's direction, yet each refined its contours. The bomber's earlier survival and eventual destruction illustrated a central truth of the conflict. Advantage was temporary, contingent on remaining ahead of an adversary equally committed to adaptation. The pressure that finally overwhelmed experience did so not through surprise, but through accumulation, closing the narrow spaces where survival had briefly existed. In that sense, the episode resolved not as tragedy or triumph, but as process, one more iteration in a contest, defined by learning, attrition, and the relentless narrowing of margins. The loss of the bomber did not register as an ending in the way stories often suggest. It entered the system as an adjustment, another entry in a ledger already dense with ink. Airfields remained busy, engines continued to turn, and crews moved through the same motions that had defined their days before the aircraft ever stood out. In the broader rhythm of the campaign, nothing paused to acknowledge that a particular pattern had concluded. The war absorbed the outcome and continued, indifferent to the brief disruption caused by one crew's accumulated experience. For those tasked with analysis, the episode offered clarity rather than mystery. Reports were compiled, trajectories plotted, and timelines aligned to show how adaptation had unfolded on both sides. What emerged was not a story of hidden technology or singular brilliance, but a demonstration of how marginal gains operate in modern warfare. The bomber's earlier survival had revealed small seams in German interception doctrine, seams that existed not because of oversight, but because no system accounts perfectly for human behavior under stress. Once those seams were identified, they narrowed, then closed. German intelligence treated the engagement as confirmation of process. Fighter control had functioned as intended, pilots executed revised attack profiles, and coordination improved under pressure. Losses elsewhere continued, but within this microcosm the learning cycle proved effective. This reinforced confidence in adaptation as the primary tool against allied numerical advantage. It also underscored the limits of improvisation when confronted by a system capable of observation, correction, and repetition at scale. On the American side, the destruction prompted no reversal of strategy. Strategic bombing remained central, justified by industrial disruption and the belief that sustained pressure would erode German capacity to fight. Crews were rotated, replacements briefed, and training adjusted incrementally. The bomber's record was referenced briefly, not as a template to be replicated, but as an illustration of how disciplined execution could extend survival without guaranteeing it. The emphasis remained on formation integrity, escort coordination, and endurance rather than individual deviation. Emotionally, the absence left by the lost crew was absorbed quietly. Their names were folded into lists read aloud, then archived. Fellow airmen felt the loss in the practical sense, noticing empty bunks and reassigned equipment. Grief existed, but it competed with fatigue and anticipation of the next mission. There was little space for reflection beyond immediate necessity. War imposed continuity, compelling those who remained to carry forward without ceremony. The episode contributed to doctrinal evolution in subtle ways. Analysts refined expectations about how long adaptations might remain effective before countered. The emphasis shifted toward flexibility within structure, acknowledging that rigid adherence to procedure could invite exploitation, while excessive deviation created vulnerability. This balance became central as the air war matured, influencing escort deployment, bombing altitudes, and engagement timing. Lessons drawn were collective rather than personal, reinforcing the impersonal nature of learning under industrialized combat. From a distance, the bomber's brief anomaly illustrated the dynamic equilibrium of the conflict. Each side possessed the capacity to learn, but neither could sustain unilateral advantage for long. Technological innovation, tactical adjustment, and human discipline interacted continuously, producing temporary imbalances that were corrected through observation and response. This process defined the strategic bombing campaign more than any single aircraft or mission. Progress was measured not by decisive moments, but by cumulative pressure applied over months and years. The skies over Europe reflected this grinding logic. Airspace grew increasingly contested, layered with radar coverage, flight belts, and patrol patterns. Bombers pressed on despite losses. Supported by expanding escort ranges and improved coordination, German defenses strained under resource constraints, yet remained lethal through efficiency and local adaptation. Within this environment, the significance of individual episodes lay in how they informed broader practice, rather than how they concluded. Historians later placed the bomber's story within this continuum, resisting the temptation to elevate it beyond proportion. Its survival and destruction illustrated principles already visible across the campaign. That innovation invites response. The discipline delays but does not prevent attrition. And that systems evolve through confrontation. The narrative fit cleanly into the larger record. Neither exceptional nor trivial. A representative thread in a vast tapestry of air combat. For the crews who followed, the war offered no reassurance drawn from past anomalies. They faced the same skies, the same procedures refined by previous losses, and the same uncertainty inherent in daylight bombing. Knowledge accumulated, but risk remained irreducible. The absence of closure was itself characteristic, reflecting a conflict where outcomes unfolded gradually and without narrative symmetry.